So first off, I will do an acknowledgement of country with Red Ed Week would usually be organized on Gadigal land, being part of UCID, but of course now being in lockdown, everyone's scattered all across the place. So if anyone wants to put their wherever they are in the chat, you're welcome to. But I think it's important, particularly when I need to do this again. I think it's important, particularly when we discuss Marxism and liberatory strategies in any capacity, to recognize the indigenous people of this land. Yeah, particularly since we'll be discussing the Black Panther Party, who had some, who regularly spoke with and uplifted indigenous socialists in other countries. But so to start off, is this? Yes, it is working. The texts, has anybody, did people read them? Feel free to go off mute. Sam, brilliant. But I take it everybody else didn't. So does anyone have any thoughts on the text or the authors of the text or anything related to it? Feel free to put a star in the chat if you wish to speak. Okay. In absence of that, I will move on. So the first text is Huey Newton's speech to Boston College in 1970. But to give some context to the Huey Newton and the Black Panther Party, first off, Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, its full official name. It was first formed in 1965 with, and these are the 6 original members of the Black Panther Party. I'm sure people will recognize Huey Newton, and perhaps people will recognize Bobby Seale and Bobby Hutton. Seale being the one in the very middle, and Hutton being the one kneeling in front of him. The others are potentially less notable, but still, of course, important in such a small organization in the beginning. They formed originally on Huey Newton and Bobby Seale met in Oakland at college in 1965, and they originally formed the party out of a desire to escape from the academic confines, so somewhat of the socialist sphere that was convening in such places at the time. So when they first became relevant, when they marched upon Sacramento Town Hall, City Hall, armed with assault rifles they first became nationally relevant then in protest of the Mulford Act, which was put forward by a younger Ronald Reagan, largely out of a desire to disarm Black people in Sacramento who were, particularly the Black Panthers, who were getting somewhat of a reputation for getting in armed conflicts with police and such. They originally, back then, they described themselves as Black nationalists, but with as the text will show, they had developments on that. To give a context to Marxism in general, prior to if anyone wants to add in or say anything, just put a star in the chat. But Marxism, what I would personally understand as the core element of Marxism, is the process of dialectical materialism, which is especially discussed in the part played by Labour in the transition from ape to man by Engels. Dialectical materialism, of course, began as, this is a diagram I quite like of it. It's essentially it's an overview of Marx's perception of history. His original perception, of course, there are developments, as we see in Huey Newton's text especially, but originally there was tribalism, which Marx would describe as patriarchy, actually. That was his term for it, which was essentially tribal organization, gift economy, like sorts of things. Essentially the primitive communism, essentially what it is, which it was trade between individuals and a somewhat collective ownership of like towns and such, on account of the very low yield agriculture, which would mean there was essentially no surplus product of the labor. You would only primitive forms of development production means you would only produce simple reproduction. So you would only essentially get enough to feed yourself. That developed with the development of further tools and such, and then we get to the era of empire, which in Huey Newton's text he describes empire. He describes two types of empires. Actually, he describes primitive empires, which he describes such as like the Roman Empire, these were empires that ruled over all of their known territory. So in areas prior to our modern communications and transport technology, the Romans essentially ruled over everything that they knew existed, or if they knew of outside territories, they rarely knew the extent to which they existed. Barbarians, of course, was the negation of this during the period. They were the opposites. There was the empire, which was the quote unquote civilized people, and there were empires like the Goths, barbarians, I mean, like the Goths, who would eventually sack Rome and bring down the formal larger Roman Empire and split into the Byzantines and such. But the end of slavery is particularly the end of such forced labor, was what created landed aristocracy, which was, lords and feudalism, essentially. The bourgeoisie formed in this, in cities, in primitive, what were primitive forms of city centers, essentially, where they would trade, where they would essentially do trade, and they began to be able to, they began to create a very primitive form of extended reproduction, where they would produce more than they needed, so they would sell it on in a free, in a capitalist sense, free trade, which meant that capital was gained, because you would have trading relationships where people would get more. Some people would essentially come out with a profit, and you would have people who were gaining wealth, as opposed to lords who were not gaining wealth. They were simply reproducing their own wealth. The only way they would gain wealth would be to conquer territories and such, which was not particularly common, and it's not really a method yet. But the rise of the bourgeoisie itself created the rise of bourgeois democracy, which created the rise of the proletariat. The rise of the proletariat largely came on account of industrialization, which saw, and a lot of people understand industrialization. There are a few ways of understanding it. Many people understand it in the USSR as, for example, collectivization, but also prior to that, when there was still privately owned feudal economy, they understand the flight of peasants to the city centers. They understand that as like a forceful moving, but most of the time, particularly in the US and such, it's actually, it's just economically more viable to live in areas of larger amounts of people, because you have the ability to sell your labor, which is what defines the proletariat class. The proletariat class is that class that sells their labor and doesn't have the capacity to sell anything else, which of course forms what we understand now as bourgeois capitalism, bourgeois democracy, liberal capitalism, liberal democracy, etc. And it is understood that the era of capitalism will come to an end, and we'll have socialism and then communism, or however that forms for the individual person. And to develop on this, which is pertinent to Engels' text, we have the laws of dialectics, which sound complicated, but are quite important to an understanding of dialectical materialism. So first, this is actually from Engels's Dialectics of Nature, which is the part played by labor is actually the 9th chapter of Dialectics of Nature, although it's unfinished as a pamphlet. But this is directly related to that. But essentially, we get the situation where you get the transformation of quantity into quality, the law of interpretation of opposites, and the law of the negation of the negation. So to go first, the negation of the negation is the easiest. So if we go back to this, we understand that unorganized society is negated by the division of labor, private property, tribalism, and such. This essentially means that unorganized, which itself leads to empire. So unorganized society is negated by the existence of empire, and unorganized society creates the conditions for which the negation of it can become the predominant form of society. So unorganized society creates the conditions for the existence of the division of labor. For example, an easier way of understanding that is bourgeois democracy, as I just explained, how industrial centers are the primary form of just sustaining as a proletariat, as like a lower class, which would create you as a proletariat. So we understand that bourgeois democracy creates the proletariat class, which is theorized at the very least, itself develops the ability to overthrow bourgeois democracy and creates post-capitalist societies in whatever form it is. So the negation of negation is essentially empire negates unorganized society. Landed aristocracy negates empire. Bourgeois democracy negates landed aristocracy, and socialism negates capitalism. And the negation forms within the previously existing society, which we understand as, which can also be understood as, which is part of the interpretation of opposites, which Engels at other times phrases as the interrelationship of opposites, or the tendency for opposites to converge and to synthesize. This I will come back to when in Huey Newton's reading, if anyone, but the law of transformation of quantity into quality is essentially the transformation of a particular social, it can be understood at times of like necessarily a capacity for development into a material form of things. So quantity into quality is the refining of, in many times will be understood as the refining of the productive forces and things such as that, and the refining of classes that comes from that, and the and such. But so if anyone, does anyone for the questions for Huey Newton reading, does anyone want to answer the first question? What is internationalism? Maddie.
Yeah, I can go. Like, I think that internationalism is the idea that the working class across the world have more in common with other people in other countries, as opposed to, this idea of nationalism that says that we, should have something in common with like Scott Morrison just because of the fact that we live in Australia.
Yes, that is true. Internationalism is a rejection of bourgeois forms of nationalism, which emerge and such. I'll explain that Huey Newton's text further. Essentially, he describes himself as an intercommunalist. He describes the Black Panther Party as officially stating itself as revolutionary intercommunalist, as opposed to Black nationalist or revolutionary socialist. The differences between the latter are menial, but the difference between Black nationalism and intercommunalism largely comes from Newton stating that the United States and the former slave people, the Black Americans of the United States, are not an internal colony of the United States, which was the original idea, an internal colony which would form its own nation of its own people. They begin to Newton, with his understanding of dialectical materialism, comes to the idea that the world's, and actually yes, this is particularly shown by his idea of empire. So as I said, there's primitive empire and there is larger modern forms of empire. Modern forms of empire is the United States, the US empire, because the US empire doesn't rule over everything that is known. It's everything is known, at least largely the structure of the earth is known. Everyone knows what every country is and such, or at least there is the ability to know every country on earth. And there's no land, at least there's no land masses or populations. There might be populations, but land masses that are unknown of by people. So and particularly with essentially it has come that the United States is an empire because the United States is a capital, is a nation state that has an implicit or explicit control over every other nation in its imperial orbit, which means it has essentially a control over the entire world by extension of imperialism on account of its absorption of all the imperialisms of other countries in the world, which largely formed post 1945, where after World War II. So Newton then comes to the conclusion that, well, you can't have nations because you have one nation that essentially has a domination of the world. So what really happens is there are communities. The world is made up of communities, and there are oppressor groups, which are dominated by the United States. So intercommunalism is the idea, as Maddie said, internationalism is the interrelation of socialist groups, or just the interrelation of proletariat or peasant, or whichever existing lower classes there are. They have a greater essentially they have more to benefit by internationally supporting each other than they have for supporting their national bourgeoisie. Intercommunalism is by extension his idea that these communities that are scattered across the world for various reasons, for example, Black Americans, largely from the the Atlantic slave trade. This is across a displaced community, but there are other forms of communities, especially, and these communities link up in the idea is intercommunalism is the formation and connection of these interrelated communities as a rejection of the larger, both national and international bourgeoisie, which is essentially formed by a sort of a pseudo-comprador class that the United States has over which dominates the world. Comprador class being an international bourgeoisie that operates like businesses and they operate some commercial or like private enterprises in other countries and such. So that's what intercommunalism is necessarily. So can anyone get an idea from this as to why revolution is impossible in the United States, or at least why Newton believes so? Yes, in a sense, I'm not sure exactly, but yeah. So essentially, he has the idea that the United States is the dominant world power. So there are, and of course, with a modern political economy understanding of the world, the United States extracts resources from the peripheral countries, which are understood to be like the global South, which could be countries like Peru or Algeria or various Africas and such. African nations, or South Africa is not really periphery, but in any case, you get and they export from those countries resources, and then they export. No, they take resources from those countries and in turn export labor labor. They export the need for labor power, essentially. So which essentially means that they have a dominance over the economies of the other countries. So the United States is itself propped up not by domestic production, but by international production and by the extraction of international of peripheral nations. So yes, the lumpen proletariat, yes, that is a good point. But with regards to this, he argues that it is impossible in the United States because it's impossible for citizens of the United States to break down these global value chains that the United States forms. Essentially, you can't stop the United States from, you can't go destroy a factory in Peru or something if you live in the United States. So essentially, there's no revolution. You can't have a revolutionary order in the United States so long as it still exists as an imperial dominant nation. With regards to the lumpen proletariat, that is a good point. So the lumpen proletariat being what Huey Newton understands, I believe Huey Newton understands it as the left wing of the proletariat, which is the more disillusioned sort of force of the proletariat. Although this part of the reading does confuse me as to whether he understands it as Marx does, which is the because Marx describes the lumpen proletariat as the least revolutionary and the most backwards of things. So if anyone, yeah, essentially, yeah. So if you want to speak on that, Sam, or if anyone.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think Marx talks about the lumpen proletariat in the 18th Roubaix. There's a quote where it's like, he's pretty brutal about them. It's like the refuse, the dung of the rest of the classes. He's not very nice. So I guess, and they're kind of integrated into a criminal element, or they're not proletarian, or they're kind of sort of in a similar proletarian condition, but they're not in consistent wage labor that the factory workers are. So they have this kind of piecemeal existence where they're kind of desperately trying to hang on, and that means they can be co-opted by kind of reactionary elements.
Yeah, no, definitely. That's what it is. Lumpen proletariat is those proletariat classes that have an inability to frequently maintain wage labor and such. Yeah, particularly as a diversion from Marx, the ideas of Fanon and Newton and of third world and black revolutionaries. Many understand the lumpen proletariat class not as a like a twisted backwards class, but as a class that have the potential to be the most revolutionary on account of them being the least landed, privileged type of people in society. So it's essentially a formation of the lowest of society, whereas Marx would understand it as, well, you can't organize when you're not in a workplace necessarily, if you're not constantly surrounded by others and such. But this takes a different form in neo-colonial societies, or colonial systems, or neo-colonial systems. Yes, and I'll reiterate, I'll explain the first part of this question. So a contradiction as opposed to a paradox. In the reading, Huey Newton says to the listeners in Boston College, he says, imagine that there is a external world of sorts, in the sense that, an external world. There is a world that is existing parallel to ours necessarily in the, I forgot who thought that. There was a philosopher. In any case, essentially, the understanding is that there are different factors acting upon the world. And when these factors come into conflict, why? I don't know why. He just says it and then uses it as a as a jumping off point to essentially say we have our current world, and then we have the class, an understanding of a class system that is necessarily running parallel to our current understanding of the world, essentially meaning that often we come in conflict with these class struggles. Individuals do, but the class struggle is, of course, the realm of all people. But we have an individual world, and then we have the larger world, which represents a more totalizing understanding of the world. So there's essentially us in our individual sense, and then there's the larger world, the external world being the larger world that we can't always view, but does exist on account of just everyone being together. So this is how you have these proletarian classes and such. And often we as individuals and particularly things come into conflict in class societies, which is the notion of class struggle. So what is a contradiction as opposed to paradox is the understanding of what I said before, which is the interrelationship of opposites. So a paradox as opposed to a contradiction. A paradox, he means it in like the dictionary definition sense, which is something that appears to be contradictory, but isn't when you look at it further, as opposed to what other people would understand it as today. But essentially, a contradiction, the contradiction is class society, the different areas of class society, and the idea of moving past class society, and the idea that a class can move towards its own abolition, which is the idea of socialism, of course, which would be the final. So many people, he said that people will describe that as a contradiction, when it is instead, it is a paradox. It is something that is inherent to an understanding of the world. These things, class conflict is the coming together of parts of societies, which creates from that, which moves humanity forward in this idea of dialectical materialism. The next stage of dialectical materialism comes from essentially the ultimate clashing of classes, and that's like the emergence of the proletarian class. The ultimate clashing with the bourgeois class creates, a dominant proletarian class as opposed to a dominant bourgeoisie class. It's the same with the abolition of the slave classes and such. And the third question, how is historical materialism and dialectical materialism differentiated? So I've described dialectical materialism. Can anyone potentially think of what he might mean by historical materialism? Yes, Alana.
Yeah, like I'm a bit of an average Marxism knower, so I could be wrong, but I think my understanding is that like dialectical materialism, as you kind of mentioned, is the sort of theory of change in which like conditions are influenced and birthed in a sense by like contradictions in ideology and in power. And like I think historical materialism is in a sense like the application of material dialectics in like any sort of analysis of social, political, economic history.
That's not exactly, that could be an understanding of it, although that's not exactly what Huey Newton understood it as. He would call that scientific socialism. Scientific socialism, which was also what Engels would call it, which is the application of dialectics upon an understanding of the world, which would come to a scientific socialist perspective, as opposed to individuals who came before Engels who were utopian socialists. They didn't have a dialectical understanding of the world. But historical materialism, under Huey Newton's notion of it, is dogma. It's a dogmatic view of past notions of what Marxism was at a particular point in time. It's like as if you were to he uses an example of 1917, the Russian Revolution. If you were to apply a strict understanding of the Russian Revolution to our current situation, well, it doesn't exactly make sense. We have populations that are much more literate. We don't have, at least apart from, but like even most countries, even a fair few countries in the periphery will have significantly larger proletarian classes than they had in Russia at the time, and also significantly smaller peasant classes. those peasant classes being abolished in some global north imperial countries, such as Australia. We don't really have a peasant class. Apart from, I guess you could understand some Pacifica people to an extent as peasant classes, but for the most part, we don't have a notable peasant class. So applying past understandings in dialectics upon the world, which is particularly why Newton takes an issue with the current state of internationalism, which is an understanding as of countries that, as of like the USSR period when it was first formed, in which there was not a dominant imperialism over the world. There were competing forms of British, French, Spanish, whatever you types of imperialism, as opposed to now, in which the United States is the dominant imperial force. It has absorbed the other imperialisms, which itself creates a sort of an imperial core. There are competing imperialisms. Some would argue that China is imperialist. That's another question. But essentially, the United States is the dominant imperialism. If you grant that China is imperialist, then you would have to also grant that for China to be most imperialist, it would have to overthrow the US as the dominant imperialist power to gain a necessary benefit from that. And Seamus put up Fanon before, which somewhat would inform an understanding of the fourth question. Does anyone know exactly what is the difference between a partially liberated territory, partially liberated people, which he described China as, and a nation, which he describes as no longer existing? If anyone wants to jump in, feel free. Oh, asterisks in the chat. I can begin to describe it. Essentially, as he said, nations, as it was generally understood, were made up of a national bourgeoisie and a national proletariat. National proletariat would sell their labor to the national bourgeoisie, who would extract surplus value profit from it. Of course, surplus value being any kind of labor any kind of profit that is gained, any kind of profit, essentially, any kind of value that exceeds exceeds what is produced in socially necessary labor time, which is understood as the average time it takes to produce a product. I hope I'm making sense so far. So a nation and a partially liberated people, or just necessarily peopled. So a nation, as Newton has established, there no longer exist these independent nations. There are an international bourgeoisie, which have essentially a dominance over a national bourgeoisie, to an extent in which we get the idea that the proletariat is essentially international already. It is essentially internationally linked through the very sense that it is under the being extracted from by the same entity, being the global, necessarily the global US empire and such. So he describes China as a partially liberated territory. This is, of course, because China still relied on levels of capitalist production at the time for well, whatever your opinions of Mao is. Mao didn't even understand China to be socialist during that period. So it's a partially liberated peoples, because necessarily the Panthers were of the opinion that they were moving towards liberation, moving towards socialism. So it would be a partially liberated peoples, partially liberated territory. A wholly liberated territory can, of course, only exist upon the overthrow of the global imperialism, the US empire. So to that extent, it does somewhat conflict. It does directly conflict with the idea of Black nationalism, which is the idea that you can form a nation state and thus be liberated in whole through forming a separate nation state, which obviously just nation, really, which obviously can't be true if there is a larger capitalism linking everything. So that was generally. Does anyone have any comment? I'm going to move on to the Engels reading next, but if anyone has any questions, comments on this reading in the chat, feel free. Or I'll move on. Okay, I hope that means that I'm making sense and not that people are confused. Engels, as for some reason I tried to make jokes here. He's father of opposable thumbs and phonetically dynamic mouths, which is generally his understanding of what differentiates man from differentiates ape from man, differentiates man from less developed animals. He was a capitalist. His dad owned a factory. He was a businessman, so perhaps he was the first USU board director. He was also a college dropout, never got a degree. It's just like me. I also don't have a degree, so maybe also German, which was never a good sign, but that was during the Prussian Empire, so maybe it's different. I don't know. But much of the Engels reading I described in the description of dialectical materialism, but there are a few important things which I should state. So as I said, opposable thumbs are phonetically dynamic mouths. That is what which was formed by the dialectical process existing within humans. So I don't know if I described it right, but the dialectical process, as I said, is the coming together of opposites. It's the conflict of different forces that comes together and forms a greater whole. So it's essentially an extension of Hegel's dialectics, except it forms a larger materialism as opposed to Hegel's understanding of the absolute idealism. So essentially, it's a material force acting on the world as opposed to whatever Hegel thought. I'm not gonna lie, I don't really get Hegel. So opposable thumbs, phonetically dynamic mouths. Those were itself formed by the dialectical process of evolution, as we all understand. Well, I assume we understood. I assume we did like year 3 biology. I'm not gonna lie, I don't actually know that. Does anyone know the acorn example? Now I'm curious, but in any case, I will look that up afterwards, and I don't know, maybe I'll have another reading group just for the acorn example. But essentially, the dialectical process as exists within individuals, or well, not individuals, of course, of larger evolutionary species is the conflict of non-ideal genes development versus the mutations which become more ideal for survival. Of course, those things which are most produce surviving species are those which survive the most. For example, I think with cats, you know how cats go limp when their parents pick them up by the scruff of the neck. It's actually an evolutionary response. Essentially, they're evolutionarily taught to do that. Evolutionarily taught to do that. If the cats that didn't go limp when their parents picked them up couldn't be moved and would essentially die. So, which is sad, but they're not dying now, so that's cool. In any case, so that's why I reference these things. So these things were developed through dialectical process within man as a species, or within the various species that led towards the current man, like Homo erectus or the other ones. I'm not an evolutionary biologist, but that is so can anyone Cartesian dualism is, of course, the mind-body problem, the idea that the mind is separate from the body. Could anybody understand why the dialectical process rejects Cartesian dualism? I can go. Essentially, the idea, as Descartes, generally not my favorite philosopher, but he had his moments. In any case, as Descartes understood it, was that there can be no way that the mind or the body itself could sufficiently create a conscience. It requires a larger force, which he attributed to religion, to a god. But essentially, the mind, you have the mind-body problem, which he solved with Cartesian dualism. The mind exists independently of the body and informs the body. The body responds, sends back feedback loops and such, and then you get humanity, and we all hang out. But Engels thinks, well, no, that can't possibly be true, because Engels was an atheist. Yes, he was quite anti-theist, and he thought, well, God's not real, so there must be a different way. And I'm not commenting on whether God is real or not, but there is a different way to this. So essentially, what formed our or humanity's advanced form of consciousness, as opposed to, say, a snake or a slug. I really hate slugs. The difference there is the dialectical process, which developed the brain, where we have things like frontal lobes that other things don't have. I'm sure if you ask a med student, they'd know better than me, but still, that's how the dialectical process forms nature. And again, opposable thumbs, which other things don't have. But apes also have opposable thumbs, but they don't have phonetically dynamic mouths, which developed over time. Of course, we didn't have mouths that could produce as many sounds as this back in the Stone Age, but we do now because of the evolutionary process, the dialectical process. Engels understands this as with regards to a huge the entire evolutionary process, but this is particularly, that's in the larger Dialectics of Nature. If anyone wants to read that, I think it's a very good text. But that is yeah. So this is particularly as it pertains to man. So this people might know this. Okay, so does it, particularly, I don't know, ECOP students maybe, I don't know. So how does anyone know how man essentially, with an understanding of dialectical materialism, the dialectical process, how does labor incorporate nature into human systems of value and, advancing human systems? In the chat, if anyone's. Okay, human labor. Yes, but what, potentially to a leading question, what does human labor make use of? Like, to what extent does human labor make use of nature? What is nature used to produce? No, you can guess. I mean, yeah. Exactly. Tools. Thank you, Sam. Tools. Tools such as, for example, the Stone Age. The Stone Age was formed from the ability to create tools out of rocks, which apparently apes are in now. So apparently some apes are in the Stone Age. So maybe we get more humans. Probably not. They're a bit slow. But means of production, yes, which would later form into a greater means of production. But to an extent, the means through which one produces things, yes, I told us that. If I just shove a rock into a larger stick or two sticks, then that's a means of production to go whack wheat and then go make bread. There were stones in the bread, but I didn't say it was good bread. So that is how laboring man incorporates nature into the larger human systems of value. Of course, any people, raw materials to extract. Yes, exactly. That as well.
Gas and wood and
yes, that is true. I don't know who said that. It was Walls, that person. Yes, that is true. Does anyone understand the different conceptions of labor, of value necessarily? Like, how does value operate differently in a primitive communist society and a bourgeois capitalist society? Yes, Thomas.
Is it to do with the difference between exchange value being the primary form of value in bourgeois capitalist society versus, is it true value, or I can't remember the word he uses for like
yes, use value.
value.
Yes,
Yeah.
use value is the same. So you would have things like social use value, which would a particular value of something. Value doesn't necessarily just mean like price. Value just means like, again, in a larger sense, what's the value? Like people, all labor processes have value. There is non-valuable labor nowadays, but that's just like moronic shit that like is produced as a consequence of late capitalism. Like to an extent, I'm no econ student. So I don't, well, not that econ students would necessarily know, but to an extent, one could ask the question of like, well, what value does a cashier necessarily add to the labor process? And that's like, I don't actually know. But there is, you could understand that as they're essentially unnecessary parts. You know, they're non-value producing, but they do represent the larger yeah, well, this goes into a further understanding of extended reproduction, which I don't have the scope to cover here, but they're more in the non-extended phase of production. They're essentially the phase of production that is reproducing itself. So to an extent, one can understand production is also, transport is also a form of production. To reproduce a product, or for a product, for a labor process to reproduce itself in that sense, what you would have to get it to people. And all that. But so the different Marxist conceptions of values are social use value and exchange value, which is not dictated by price, well, at least Marx and Engels would not tell you that it's dictated by supply and demand. Supply and demand is essentially a margin of error of sorts, a top and bottom thing, which generally will a larger socially yeah, Maddie, that's right. Yeah, it was value dump. Yeah, in that sense. But in societies which produce commodities, which is goods produced for trade rather than for use, as Sam says, no longer primitive communism, because things are not produced exclusively for use. They're produced exclusively. There are things that are produced exclusively for the purpose of trade. Most things are commodities nowadays, but yeah. So essentially, that's the different conceptions of values. Value is produced, commodity production produces a kind of exchange value, which isn't dictated by supply and demand. It's largely dictated by demand, by supply. I mean, as in those things which are most produced are the things that are most sought to be sold necessarily. That's how I think Marx has a quote that pretty much says that. But in any case, that is necessarily the truth. Like, do people really think, like, I mean, and in a more informal way, like the supreme brick, like there's no way that like there is this genuine supply for a brick that says supreme on it. Like nobody wants that. Nobody really wants that. But the demand, the supply, nobody, like there's no fucking demand for that. But the guys are like, well, look, this is supreme brick. It's one in a kind. It's a supreme. And then everyone's like, oh my God, now I want it. Well, see, exactly. This is my point. You're a victim of the capitalist process, Alana. Exactly. So yeah, like, and to an extent, there are some things which. Seamus, don't maybe talk about poetry aloud. Yes, it can. Yes, but I don't know. Do you want to talk about that?
okay, I'm not very qualified on it, so I don't think I'm very good at. I haven't actually read all of political economy to sign. But basically, it's this idea that within mass production, the commodities have less value solely based on their exchange value and their use value, and more along the lines of also sign value in terms of the way they represent wealth. So the difference between, let's say, a Rolls Royce and Toyota might not actually be worth that much purely in terms of the actual product, like commodity itself, but also due to the status that having a Rolls Royce brings. So you're paying also for the status that buying a Supreme brick has, right? It's something that gives off this perception as if you have money and that you have a higher status within society, I guess.
Yeah,
that's at least my understanding.
Yeah, no, that is true. It's a sort of a pseudo value, I guess. It's a social value, but not in like a use value. It's exclusively a reputational value of sorts, I guess. Which is not necessarily supply and demand, because of course these are influenced by greater processes. Supply and demand is said to be a fundamental process, which dictates like all of human society. It dictates every exchange between humans. Of course, if something is influenced by what it appears to be as people, this is something that's only going to exist within larger, market societies, which is not, as we understand, which is not necessarily the exclusive domain of humans, which is granted to be by things. But in any case, before we go too late, this question this isn't actually to do with the reading, so anyone can answer this. This actually isn't in the reading, but has anyone so what do people think? Do people think that dialectical development is man at a state in which it is higher than nature, separated by nature by any sense, or is it still exclusively a product of nature and thus existent within nature? Do you want to elaborate on that, Sam?
I guess sort of kind of has something to do with it, but the metabolic rift is the idea that, particularly in capitalism, industrialization has created. I'm not really a biologist or a geographer or whatever, so I'm not completely qualified for it. But the idea is sort of that the kind of cycle of input and output of human civilization into nature have kind of gone off the fair balance. So industrialization poisons the soil, in a sense.
Yes, that's how I would personally describe it as well. Of course, man is existent within nature, but there are different ideas necessarily that people have within society as regards to is man part of nature. Like some most people would not tell you like, oh yeah, we're just like basically the same as koalas. People wouldn't say that, and that's true, because we're not, because we do have a higher form of consciousness and a higher form of thumbs than koalas. But this doesn't necessarily mean that man is separated from nature. Necessarily, the idea that man is separated from nature has there are a number of consequences that people can draw from that, but it does present the issue that, I mean, man isn't separated from nature. There's nothing that differentiates us from an ape. Anything other than what is biologically has been what is biologically developed within us. As I said, the thumbs and the mouth is the largest reason why we are in the situation which we are. So how could we be unnatural when we develop from natural processes? Everything that we use is natural. No, computer chips don't fall from the sky. They don't grow on trees, but they're formed from naturally occurring materials. At least that's my understanding. If anyone wants to give a take. Other than that, since it's been an hour, I'll probably wrap up. So thanks everyone for listening to my my rambling.
Thanks, Iki. I think that was, yeah,
Thanks,
for
Iggy.
everyone. I'm sure we loved it. Yeah, we all loved it. Yeah, the recording will be on YouTube at some point if you ever want to listen back. And yeah, take care, everyone.